something that most analysts are missing about what's unfolding right now in Ukraine. And by the time we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why this war has entered one of its most dangerous and strategically consequential phases yet. What Russia just did and what Ukraine did in response tells us everything we need to know about where this conflict is heading. And I'll warn you now, what I'm going to lay out in the second half of this briefing will fundamentally change the way you think about the next chapter of this war. Here's the bottom line up front. Russia launched the most massive, most coordinated aerial bombardment of this entire conflict. Over 2,000 missiles and drones unleashed in consecutive waves, night after night, deliberately designed to overwhelm every layer of Ukraine's air defense architecture. 24 civilians dead in Kyiv alone. Apartment buildings reduced to rubble. Families buried under collapsed concrete. This was not a tactical strike. This was not aimed at military infrastructure. This was a deliberate campaign of terror, calculated, methodical, and premeditated, and the man who ordered it did so from a position that is far weaker than the optics suggest. We're going to unpack exactly why that matters. First, let's establish the military context, because context is everything in strategic analysis. Over the course of 2 consecutive nights, Russia launched more than 700 missiles and drones in each rolling 24-hour window. President Zelensky described them accurately as non-stop, continuous bombardments. But here's what the headlines didn't tell you. Russia was able to generate that volume of firepower not because its industrial base has surged to overwhelming capacity, but because it had been deliberately holding back, stockpiling, rationing its strikes in the weeks prior. And that restraint coincided almost exactly with the Victory Day ceasefire that was brokered under pressure from Washington. Think about that carefully. Russia used a diplomatic pause, a ceasefire framed publicly as a gesture of goodwill, as cover to reconstitute its strike inventory. That is not the behavior of a military that is winning comfortably. That is the behavior of a military that needs to manufacture moments of overwhelming force precisely because it cannot sustain them continuously. Now, I want you to hold that thought because there's a layer to this story that connects Russia's desperation on the battlefield to what Ukraine did next. And it is more significant than anything you've read in the mainstream coverage. Stay with me. Let's talk about what Ukraine agreed to and why. Zelensky's government initially pushed back against the ceasefire framework, and they were right to do so from a purely military standpoint. A unilateral pause benefits the side that is on the strategic defensive, which at this stage of the conflict, for all its tactical aggression, is Russia. Ukraine ultimately accepted the ceasefire for one reason that had genuine humanitarian weight: a prisoner exchange. 1,000 prisoners in each direction. Soldiers who had endured the horrors of Russian captivity coming home. That is a real and meaningful outcome. But the military cost was measurable. Russia got the breathing room it needed. It staged its Victory Day parade, a diminished affair stripped of much of its usual grandeur, because the threat environment around Moscow has fundamentally changed. And then, the moment that pause expired, Russia unleashed hell on Ukrainian cities. If you think that sequence of events is disturbing, what I'm about to tell you about Ukraine's response and the strategic leverage it is now exercising is going to sharpen your understanding of this conflict in ways that the daily news cycle simply cannot capture. Ukraine's answer was not symbolic. It was not emotional. It was strategically precise and operationally significant. Within 24 hours, Ukrainian long-range strike assets were reaching deep into Russian territory, not at the front lines, not at the border region, but hundreds of miles inside Russia itself. The Ryazan oil refinery, approximately 300 miles from the nearest Ukrainian-controlled territory, was struck with significant effect. A Gazprom gas processing facility in Astrakhan, 550 miles inside Russia, was hit. Let me put that in geographic perspective for you. 550 miles. That is farther than the distance from Washington, D.C. to Detroit. Ukraine is reaching that deep into Russian strategic infrastructure and doing so with growing regularity and precision. The Yeysk airfield, roughly 100 miles from the front lines, was also struck, and the Taman port overlooking the Kerch Strait, the critical choke point linking sovereign Russian territory to the occupied Crimean Peninsula, was also hit. Now, why does that last target matter so much? Because it connects directly to a broader strategic effort that Ukraine has been quietly developing for months, and it is one of the most important military dynamics in this entire conflict right now. I want to make sure you understand it fully, because what's happening to Russia's land bridge is going to shape the outcome of this war. Let me explain what the land bridge is and why it is so critical to Russian operational sustainability. The land bridge is the corridor of territory seized and held by Russian forces, running from Mariupol westward through Berdyansk and Melitopol, connecting sovereign Russian territory to the northern tip of the Crimean Peninsula at Chonhar. This corridor is not simply a political trophy. It is the logistical spine of Russia's entire southern operational theater. Every tank, every artillery shell, every fuel truck, every reinforcement moving toward Russian forces in western Crimea and along the southern front has to traverse some portion of that corridor. Control of that land bridge gives Russia the ability to sustain a large and heavily equipped force in the south. Threaten the land bridge, really threaten it, and you begin to strangle the entire southern axis of Russian military power. Now, here is what is genuinely significant about the current moment, and I want you to pay close attention, because this is where the strategic picture changes dramatically. Ukraine has achieved what military professionals call fire control over the land bridge. Let me be precise about what that term means, because it is used loosely in public discourse and it deserves precision. Fire control in the operational sense means the demonstrated ability to deliver fires, munitions, strike assets, precision effects to a designated point at a time of your choosing with sufficient accuracy and mass to achieve the desired effect on the target. In plain terms, it means Ukraine can now hold the roads of that land bridge at risk on demand using medium-range drone systems. Russian vehicles, supply convoys, logistics trains, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers attempting to use those roads are now operating under persistent threat, not theoretical threat, demonstrated, repeatable, operationally significant threat. And if you think that development is important in isolation, wait until you hear how it connects to Russia's deepening vulnerability across the entire southern front. The next part of this briefing is where the strategic picture becomes truly alarming for Moscow. Let me give you the historical context that makes this development so striking. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine launched its most ambitious offensive operation of the war. The strategic objective of that offensive was precisely this: to drive south through Orikhiv toward the Sea of Azov and sever that land bridge, cut it entirely, or at minimum bring it within range of artillery and rocket systems sufficient to make it operationally unusable. That offensive failed to achieve its objectives. The Surovikin line, layers of minefields, fortified defensive positions, anti-tank obstacles, and prepared kill zones stopped Ukraine's armed formations before they could break through to the south. It was one of the most painful and costly chapters of the war for Ukrainian forces. Brave soldiers, well-trained and motivated, were ground down against defenses that had been constructed with deliberate, sophisticated engineering over many months. But here is what that failure revealed, and what Ukraine learned from it. The path to neutralizing the land bridge did not have to run through a frontal armored assault against prepared defenses. There was another way, and Ukraine found it, not with tanks and infantry, but with medium-range drone systems capable of persistent, accurate, and affordable strike operations at scale. What Ukraine's army could not achieve with armored brigades in 2023, Ukraine's drone forces are now achieving incrementally, systematically, and at a fraction of the human cost. That is a profound lesson in military adaptation, and it speaks to the institutional learning capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces, which continues to impress every serious military analyst who examines this conflict without ideological bias. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Because the land bridge situation, as significant as it is only one element of a broader strategic compression that Russia is experiencing simultaneously from multiple directions. And when you see all of these pressures mapped together, a very different picture of this war emerges than what the casualty maps and territorial lines suggest on their own. Russia is under pressure in the deep, meaning far behind its own borders, from Ukraine's long-range strike campaign against energy infrastructure, oil refining capacity, and industrial production. Every refinery that burns, every gas processing plant that goes offline, every airfield that takes damage represents a degradation of Russia's ability to sustain this war economically and logistically over time. Russia is under pressure in the operational depth, the zone 50 kilometers or more behind the front lines, from expanded medium-range drone operations that have turned the resupply of frontline Russian units into an extraordinarily costly and dangerous undertaking. And Russia is under pressure along the land bridge, a critical vulnerability that, if Ukraine can continue to develop and exploit it, could fundamentally alter the balance of forces in the south. 3 simultaneous axes of pressure, none of them individually decisive, but together, and this is the key insight I want you to take from this briefing, together they represent a strategic situation that is considerably more complex and dangerous for Vladimir Putin than the battlefield maps alone would suggest. And yet, and I say this with the discipline that serious strategic analysis demands, Russia still retains enormous capacity to inflict catastrophic destruction on Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. The bombardment we witnessed this past week is proof of that. 2,000 missiles and drones, apartment buildings collapsed, families killed in their homes. That is not the footprint of a defeated military. That is the footprint of a military that is being pressured and is responding with indiscriminate mass violence because precision and strategic effect are increasingly beyond its reach. There is one more dimension to what happened this week that I have not addressed yet, and it may be the most alarming development of all, because what Russia is now reportedly planning goes beyond anything it has done before in this conflict. And understanding it requires understanding something about the unwritten rules that both sides have until now chosen to observe. Throughout this war, amid all the horror, all the devastation, all the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, there has existed one boundary that both Russia and Ukraine have, by apparent mutual understanding, chosen not to cross. No strikes on the centers of political and governmental decision-making, no attacks on parliaments, no direct strikes on presidential offices, on the institutional seats of government power. Military professionals refer to these as decision-making centers, the nodes of command, authority, and governance that keep a nation functioning as a coherent political and military entity. Both sides have observed this boundary with remarkable consistency, given the scale and ferocity of everything else this war has produced. And now, according to intelligence received and publicly disclosed by Ukrainian authorities, Russia is preparing to cross it. Let me be direct about what that means and why every serious strategic analyst needs to treat this development with the gravity it deserves. This is not a rhetorical threat. Russia has issued threats of this nature before, and in previous instances, those threats were broadly interpreted as messages directed not at Ukraine alone, but at Ukraine's Western partners. Warnings calibrated to discourage the delivery of new weapon systems, to create hesitation in European and American decision-making circles. Those threats historically triggered embassy evacuations, urgent consultations among allied governments, and in some cases, temporary pauses in the announcement of new military assistance packages. They were instruments of coercive diplomacy as much as genuine operational warnings. But the current intelligence assessment is different in character, and the surrounding context makes it significantly more credible. To understand why, you have to look at the totality of what Russia has done and signaled in recent weeks, and place this threat within that larger pattern of behavior. Because when you do, a coherent and deeply concerning picture emerges. Consider what we have witnessed in sequence. Russia stages a massive, unprecedented aerial bombardment of Ukrainian cities. the largest of the entire war. It kills civilians in their homes, collapses apartment buildings, and overwhelms air defense systems through sheer volume. It does this immediately following a ceasefire that it used to reconstitute its strike inventory. It then reportedly begins planning strikes on governmental decision-making centers, a threshold it has never previously crossed. And simultaneously, intelligence reporting indicates increased security measures around Vladimir Putin personally and around the Moscow metropolitan area more broadly. Taken together, these are not the actions and indicators of a leadership that feels strategically confident. These are the actions and indicators of a leadership that feels cornered. That is reaching for escalatory options, because the options it has already exercised are not producing the strategic outcomes it needs. And if you think the threat to governmental decision-making centers is the ceiling of Russia's potential escalation, I want you to reconsider that assumption carefully. Because history teaches us that leaders who feel genuinely threatened, who perceive their regime's survival as being at stake, do not always stop at the options that rational strategic calculus would suggest. The pressure on Putin is real. The military situation, despite Russia's continued advances in certain sectors, is strategically more complicated than at any previous point in this conflict. Ukraine's ability to reach deep inside Russia to strike at the economic and energy infrastructure that sustains the war effort, to threaten the land bridge that anchors the southern front, to demonstrate persistent and expanding long-range strike capability, represents a genuine strategic challenge that Putin's military and political advisors cannot simply absorb or dismiss. Now, let me shift to a dimension of this conflict that has received far too little analytical attention in Western commentary. And that is the question of what fire control over the land bridge actually means for the trajectory of the war going forward. Because the implications extend well beyond what is visible on any current map of the conflict. When Ukraine establishes persistent fire control over the land bridge corridor, it creates conditions that compound over time. Russian logistics commanders are forced to make choices, none of them good. They can attempt to move supplies along routes that are under drone threat, accepting losses that will accumulate with every convoy that takes a hit. They can reduce the frequency and volume of supply runs, which degrades the readiness and combat effectiveness of the forces those supply lines are supposed to sustain. They can attempt to develop alternative routes, but the geography of the region offers limited alternatives, and those alternatives are themselves increasingly within range of Ukrainian strike systems. Or they can divert resources toward force protection of the supply lines themselves, which means pulling assets away from other missions and accepting the operational cost of that diversion. There is no clean solution available to Russian logistics planners in that environment. Every option involves accepting some degree of degradation, and degradation that compounds over weeks and months has a way of producing sudden, dramatic operational consequences that can look to outside observers as though they emerged without warning. They did not emerge without warning. They were the product of accumulated pressure that finally crossed a threshold. That is precisely what happened when Russian forces were ultimately compelled to withdraw from Kherson. The conditions that made that withdrawal necessary were built over many months of patient, systematic pressure on Russian logistics and supply lines. The withdrawal itself looked sudden. The conditions that produced it were anything but. I want to be clear. I am not predicting an imminent Russian collapse in the south. That would be analytically irresponsible given the complexity of the situation and the genuine combat power that Russian forces continue to project in multiple sectors. What I am saying is that the strategic logic of persistent pressure on the land bridge, combined with deep strikes on Russian energy and industrial infrastructure, combined with the demonstrated expansion of Ukrainian long-range strike capability, creates a cumulative burden on Russian operational sustainability that is real, measurable, and growing. And that matters enormously for how this war is likely to develop over the next 6 to 12 months. Now, there is another element of this week's developments that deserves careful examination, and it speaks to the broader political and diplomatic environment within which this military conflict is being fought. Because wars are never purely military contests. They are always simultaneously political struggles, and the political dimensions of this conflict are becoming increasingly complex in ways that will shape the military outcomes. The prisoner exchange, 205 individuals returned in each direction, representing the first installment of the 1,000 for 1,000 agreement secured in connection with the Victory Day ceasefire, is genuinely significant. Not because it changes the military balance, it does not, but because it demonstrates that channels of communication and negotiation remain open, that both sides retain the capacity and, in certain circumstances, the willingness to reach limited agreements, and that Ukrainian soldiers who have endured Russian captivity are coming home. That matters morally. It also matters strategically, because the willingness to engage in prisoner exchanges is one of the indicators that genuine negotiation remains a possibility, however distant and however fraught. At the same time, the reported appearance of Andriy Yermak, President Zelensky's former chief of staff and one of the most influential figures in the Ukrainian government, before a corruption court is a development that Western analysts and policymakers need to take seriously. Ukraine's struggle against endemic corruption is not a peripheral issue. It is central to the long-term sustainability of Western support for the Ukrainian war effort. Every dollar, every euro, every artillery shell that Western governments send to Ukraine is sent with the understanding, explicit or implicit, that it will be used to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and its people, not to enrich the politically connected. If credible evidence emerges that members of Zelensky's inner circle have used their positions for personal financial gain, the political consequences in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, and London could be significant. Yermak has denied any wrongdoing. Ukraine's own investigative institutions are conducting the inquiry, which is itself a positive indicator of institutional function. But this is a story that will bear watching with close attention. And speaking of Western capitals, the reported discussions around Germany potentially acquiring Ukraine's Palianitsia missiles as an alternative to the American Tomahawk cruise missile system is a strategically significant indicator of a broader trend that deserves serious analytical attention. European NATO members are being compelled, not by choice, but by the erratic and unpredictable character of current American defense policy, to develop contingency plans that reduce their dependence on American weapon systems and American security guarantees. The Tomahawk is a significantly more capable system than anything currently in Europe's indigenous inventory. Longer range, more sophisticated guidance, greater warhead effectiveness, more resilient to electronic countermeasures. A European alternative capable of performing comparable missions does not exist today. But the fact that Germany is reportedly exploring the acquisition of Ukrainian-produced long-range cruise missiles tells you something important about the strategic psychology of European defense establishments right now. They are hedging. They are preparing for a future in which American reliability cannot be assumed. That is a profound shift in the foundational architecture of Western collective defense. And it has implications that extend far beyond any single weapons procurement decision. Let me bring all of these threads together now, because the strategic picture that emerges when you hold all of these developments simultaneously is one of a conflict that is simultaneously more dangerous and more consequential than at any previous point in its 3-year history. What I know with confidence, after a career spent studying war and its consequences, is this. The decisions being made right now in Kyiv, in Moscow, in Washington, in Berlin, in Paris, and London will shape the security architecture of Europe for a generation. The stakes could not be higher, and the cost of getting it wrong could not be greater. That is the strategic reality of this moment, and every one of us, analyst, policymaker, citizen, has an obligation to understand it with clarity, to speak about it with honesty, and to demand of our leaders the courage and the wisdom that this moment requires. I'm General Jack Keane. Stay informed, stay engaged, and understand that what happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine.